How did they study back then? In a world without Google or even light bulbs? How did a medieval student get anything done? What was their essential gear around the 13th century, besides the trusty feather pen? Number 9. The parchment knife. Parchment knife, sometimes simply called the penknife, was a tiny but mighty tool in the medieval student's kit. It was not just for whittling a fresh quill to a fine point, though that was certainly one of its primary daily functions. A good parchment knife had a sturdy, sharp blade, often made of steel, though iron was more common in earlier periods. The handle might be carved from bone, wood, or even horn, shaped to fit comfortably in the hand. Some knives featured elaborate designs, perhaps with a decorative pommel or a small intricate carving on the grip, reflecting the owner's status or personal taste. A basic student would possess a simple, functional tool, while a master scribe or a wealthy scholar might own one with a finely polished blade and an elegant hilt. Sharpening a quill was a skill in itself. The student would take a feather, often from a goose or a swan, and carefully trim its tip. The parchment knife allowed for precision. First, the very end of the feather would be cut off diagonally. Then, a slit would be made straight up the middle of the shaft, creating two halves of a nib. Finally, the knife would be used to shave down the sides of the nib, shaping it and giving it the flexibility needed to hold and release ink smoothly onto the page. This process required a steady hand and a keen eye, as an uneven cut could result in a scratchy pen that tore the delicate parchment or delivered an inconsistent flow of ink. Students practiced this technique repeatedly, often going through many feathers before mastering the art of the perfect nib. Historical records from scriptoria often mention the presence of numerous discarded feather shafts, testament to this learning curve. Beyond quill preparation, the parchment knife had another crucial role, aiding in corrections. Errors on parchment were inevitable, even for the most experienced scribes, since paper was not widely available or affordable for academic texts until much later in the period. Students worked on parchment, which was made from treated animal skin. This material was robust, but also challenging to modify. If a mistake was made, a student could not simply grab a modern eraser. Instead, they would carefully scrape away the top layer of the parchment where the ink had stained. The sharp edge of the parchment knife, held at a shallow angle, would gently lift the ink without digging too deep into the surface. This scraping technique required immense patience and skill. Too much pressure, and the parchment would be damaged, creating a thin spot or even a hole. Not enough pressure, and the ink would remain visible. The scraped area would then need to be smoothed, often with a pumice stone or a bone folder, before new ink could be applied. This meticulous process highlights the value of parchment and the labor involved in creating medieval texts. Scholars like Dr. Alistair Finch have studied the evidence of these corrections in surviving manuscripts, noting the prevalence of scraped errors. The knife also served in the preparation of the parchment itself. While most students would receive pre-prepared sheets of parchment, some might engage in the earlier stages of manuscript creation, especially in monastic schools. Before ink could be applied, parchment needed to be extremely smooth and clean. Any rough patches or grease spots would repel the ink, causing it to feather or blob. Parchment knife, with its keen edge, could be used to meticulously scrape away any remaining hair follicles, imperfections, or unevenness on the surface. This initial smoothing laid the groundwork for a flawless writing surface. This scraping was distinct from error correction. It was part of the initial refinement of the material. Furthermore, a parchment knife was useful for cutting the large sheets of vellum into smaller, manageable quires or folios for binding. When a student or scribe finished copying a section of a text, these pages would need to be trimmed to a uniform size before being gathered and sewn into a book. The knife ensured clean, straight edges, contributing to the overall neatness and durability of the finished codex. Some medieval illustrations show scribes holding their parchment knives while working, indicating their constant presence on the writing desk. The versatility of this simple tool meant it was almost always within arm's reach of any student or scholar engaged in literary work. Its small size made it portable, easily tucked into a satchel alongside other essential instruments, ready for use whether in a bustling scriptorium, a quiet monastic cell, or a dimly lit lecture hall. Without a reliable parchment knife, a student would struggle to maintain their quills, correct their inevitable mistakes, or prepare their writing surfaces, making their academic journey considerably more difficult and their output less refined. Number 8. The inkwell. The inkwell was much more than a simple container for liquid. It was the lifeblood of medieval scholarship, a vessel holding the very essence of recorded knowledge. For a student, the inkwell was an indispensable part of their daily routine, placed carefully on their writing desk, ready for the next dip of the quill. These small pots came in a variety of materials and designs, reflecting both practicality and at times considerable artistry. Common inkwells were made from horn, pottery, or even hollowed-out animal bones, materials readily available and easy to shape. More elaborate versions, often owned by wealthier scholars or master scribes, could be crafted from metal, such as bronze or pewter, sometimes adorned with decorative engravings or small sculpted figures. The opening at the top was usually narrow, designed to minimize evaporation and prevent spills, a critical feature when working with precious parchment. The ink itself, stored within these wells, was a complex substance. The most common type used throughout the medieval period was iron gall ink. Its recipe involved galls, which are growths found on oak trees, caused by the larvae of gall wasps. These galls were crushed and steeped in water, releasing tannic and gallic acids. Iron salts, typically ferrous sulfate, were then added, along with a binding agent like gum arabic, derived from acacia trees. The gum arabic acted as a thickener, allowing the ink to flow smoothly from the quill and adhere to the parchment without smudging too easily. When first applied to parchment, iron gall ink would appear somewhat pale, often brownish or yellowish. However, upon exposure to air, the iron compounds would oxidize, causing the ink to darken over time to a rich, permanent black. This chemical reaction meant that the ink was remarkably durable, resisting fading and water damage for centuries, a key reason why so many medieval manuscripts survive with their text still legible. Historical chemists have analyzed the composition of inks from various periods, confirming the prevalence of iron gall formulations. Another type of ink, though less common for formal texts, was lamp black ink. This was made from soot collected from burning oil or resin, mixed with water and gum arabic. Lamp black ink produced a very deep matte black, but it tended to be less permanent than iron gall ink, as it sat more on the surface of the parchment rather than penetrating its fibers. It was sometimes used for initial outlines or for less formal documents. For students learning to write, lamp black ink might be used for practice exercises on wax tablets or scrap parchment. Due to its relative simplicity to prepare, the challenge of maintaining ink in the inkwell was constant. The consistency of the ink was crucial. If it was too thick, it would clog the quill or not flow evenly. If it was too thin, it would feather excessively on the parchment, creating blurry lines. Students often had to add small amounts of water to their inkwells to maintain the correct viscosity, especially in dry conditions or as the ink aged. Keeping the ink free from dust and debris was another concern. A speck of dust in the inkwell could be picked up by the quill, leading to a smudge on the pristine parchment. Many inkwells had small, tightly fitting lids or stoppers to protect the ink from environmental contamination and evaporation. Placement of the ink well on the student's desk was also important. It needed to be close enough for easy dipping but far enough away to avoid accidental knocking. A spilled inkwell could ruin an entire sheet of costly parchment, a disaster for a student on a tight budget. Some inkwells were designed with a wide, stable base to prevent tipping. In larger scriptoria, communal inkwells might be present, or students would each have their own, depending on the school's resources and organization. The sound of quills dipping into inkwells and the rhythmic scratching on parchment would have been a constant backdrop in any medieval study space. The very act of preparing the ink, pouring it into the well, and carefully tending to its consistency was an integral part of a student's daily craft, a tangible connection to the physical act of knowledge creation. Without a reliable ink well providing a consistent supply of well-made ink, the medieval student's ability to record and transmit knowledge would have been severely hampered, making their academic pursuits nearly impossible. Number 7. The pumice stone. Pumice stone might seem like an odd item for a student's stucatweight, but for anyone working with parchment in the medieval period, it was absolutely essential. Parchment, as mentioned earlier, was prepared animal skin, typically from sheep, goats, or calves. Even after extensive scraping, stretching, and drying, the surface of parchment could retain minor imperfections. These imperfections, such as tiny hairs, unevenness, or residual grease, could cause serious problems for writing. Ink would not adhere properly. It would feather out along the fibers, or it would simply refuse to be absorbed, creating splotches or lines that skipped. This is where the pumice stone came into play. The pumice stone, a lightweight, porous volcanic rock, was used as a natural abrasive. Its slightly rough, granular surface was perfect for smoothing and preparing the parchment sheet before writing began. A medieval student would take a piece of parchment, lay it flat on a firm surface, and gently rub the pumice stone over the areas that needed refining. This rubbing action would microscopically abrade the surface, removing any lingering impurities and creating a fine nap that allowed the ink to sit perfectly and prevent feathering. It was a delicate balance. Too much pressure or too vigorous rubbing could thin the parchment, making it fragile or even creating holes. Just the right amount of pressure would result in a pristine, smooth surface, ready for the meticulous work of copying text or sketching an illustration. This process of preparing the writing surface was known as pouncing, or pouncing the vellum, as scholars like Michel Brown have detailed in their studies of medieval manuscript production. The pumice stone was also invaluable for correcting mistakes. When a student made an error with their quill and ink, they couldn't simply erase it like modern paper allows. Instead, they would carefully scrape away the top layer of ink with their parchment knife. This scraping, however, often left the surface of the parchment slightly rough or uneven. If new ink were applied directly to this scraped patch, it would likely feather, bleed, or look noticeably different from the surrounding text. After scraping, the student would then use the pumice stone to gently smooth the re-exposed area. This restored the original texture of the parchment, allowing new ink to be applied backing, making the correction almost invisible to the casual observer. The ability to make near-perfect corrections was a hallmark of skilled scribes and an aspiration for diligent students, particularly given the high cost of parchment. A single sheet of parchment could be worth a significant amount, representing hours of labor in preparation and the life of an animal. Every effort was made to preserve and perfect each sheet. Beyond initial preparation and error correction, the pumice stone also played a role in preparing parchment for illumination, the intricate decorative art that often adorned important manuscripts. Before vibrant pigments could be applied, the surface needed to be absolutely flawless to ensure the colors would adhere evenly and brilliantly. The gentle abrasive action of the pumice ensured that the parchment was receptive to both ink and paint, preventing any future flaking or deterioration of the artwork. Process of preparing the writing surface was often considered as important as the act of writing itself. The texture left by the pumice stone was not simply smooth. It created a microscopic tooth on the surface of the parchment, providing just enough grip for the ink to sit beautifully without blurring. It ensured consistency across the page, something vital for producing legible and aesthetically pleasing manuscripts. Without the pumice stone, students would have faced an uphill battle against bleeding, ink-smudged characters and perpetually rough surfaces. Their texts would have been messy, hard to read, and certainly less durable over time. The humble pumice stone, therefore, enabled the precision and longevity that characterize so many surviving medieval documents, making it a silent but powerful partner in the medieval student's relentless pursuit of knowledge and mastery of the written word. Its presence on the writing desk signified a commitment to quality and attention to detail, fundamental virtues in the academic environment of the time. Number 6. The wax tablets and stylus. Before the widespread availability of paper, and even alongside costly parchment, medieval students relied heavily on wax tablets for their everyday notes, drafts, exercises, and temporary records. These ingenious devices were the medieval equivalent of a modern notebook, endlessly reverse-ep and highly practical. A wax tablet consisted of one or more thin wooden boards, often made of boxwood or beech, with a shallow, hollowed-out central area. This hollow was then filled with a layer of dark wax, typically beeswax, mixed with soot or pigments to make it dark, providing a strong contrast against the marks made by a stylus. The boards were sometimes hinged together, forming a diptych or triptych, allowing for multiple surfaces and protection for the wax when closed. Some tablets even had a small hole at one end, enabling them to be strung together or attached to a belt, making them easily portable for students moving between lectures or study spaces. To write on the wax tablet, a student used a stylus. This tool was usually a thin rod made of bone metal, like bronze or iron, or wood. One end of the stylus was pointed, used for incising characters into the soft wax. The other end was typically flattened or spoon-shaped, designed for smoothing over the wax to erase what had been written. This dual functionality made the stylus an incredibly efficient instrument for dynamic note-taking. A student could rapidly jot down lecture points, sketch diagrams, or practice their letter forms without wasting precious and expensive parchment. When the notes were no longer needed, a simple rub with the blunt end of the stylus would clear the surface, preparing it for new entries. The act of pressing the stylus into the wax created a tangible, tactile connection to the writing process, distinct from the fluid motion of a quill on parchment. Wax tablets were indispensable for a variety of academic tasks. In a university setting, students attending lectures would use them to quickly transcribe spoken words from their professors. These initial notes were often fragmentary, serving as memory aids. Later, in the quiet of their study space, students would transcribe these rough notes onto more permanent parchment sheets, expanding on them and organizing the information. This method of first drafting on wax and then transcribing onto parchment was a common practice, saving time and money. Legal students, for example, might record key arguments during a courtroom observation, then refine them into a more formal brief. Medical students might sketch anatomical diagrams or note down symptoms. The ephemeral nature of wax tablets made them perfect for this iterative process of learning and refinement. Beyond lectures, wax tablets were used for drafting letters, composing sermons, working out mathematical problems, or even drawing initial sketches for illuminated manuscripts. A student learning to read or write would use them for endless practice, perfecting their letter formation without the cost of parchment or the permanence of ink. The flexibility of the wax surface allowed for continuous revision, a luxury not afforded by ink and parchment. The The sound of the stylus scratching on wax would have been a common background noise in any medieval classroom or study hall, a distinct contrast to the quiet scratching of quills on parchment. The durability of wax tablets, despite their seemingly fragile surface, made them long-lasting tools. If the wax became too worn or marked by repeated use, it could simply be melted down and resurfaced, providing a fresh writing surface. This made them an environmentally conscious and economically smart choice for medieval students, who often had limited resources. Archaeological finds have uncovered numerous wax tablets from various medieval sites, attesting to their widespread use across different social strata and academic fields. Some of these tablets still bear faint impressions of the writing, offering direct glimpses into the daily lives and studies of medieval people. Without the humble wax tablet and its accompanying stylus, the medieval student would have been severely limited in their ability to take spontaneous notes, practice their craft, or refine their thoughts before committing them to the more permanent and costly medium of parchment. It was a tool that bridged the gap between transient thought and enduring knowledge. Number 5. The ruler and lead point. Precision was paramount in medieval manuscript production, and for the student aspiring to create legible and beautiful texts, the ruler and lead point were non-negotiable tools. These instruments allowed for the meticulous planning and execution of page layout, ensuring straight lines of text, consistent margins, and evenly spaced columns. The ruler, often a simple strip of wood, bone, or metal, varied in length, but was always straight and smooth. Unlike modern rulers, they rarely featured etched measurements. Instead, their function was primarily to guide the hand. Some were quite robust, while others might be thinner, designed for more delicate work. The lead point, also known as a plummet or a stylus plumbarius, was the medieval equivalent of a pencil. It was a small piece of lead, or a lead alloy, sometimes set into a wooden or metal holder for easier grip. Unlike modern graphite pencils, pure lead left a very faint, silvery gray mark, which was ideal for ruling lines on parchment because it could be easily erased or would fade over time, leaving the written text clean and unobstructed. This faintness was a key advantage. It allowed the ruling to serve its purpose as a guide without interfering with the final appearance of the ink. The use of lead points for ruling dates back to antiquity, continuing through the medieval period and evolving into early forms of graphite pencils. Before a single letter of ink touched the parchment, a medieval student would engage in an elaborate process called ruling, or pricking and ruling. This involved preparing the sheet to ensure every line of text would be perfectly horizontal and consistently spaced. First, the student would use a small pointed tool like an awl or the point of their parchment knife to prick tiny holes along the edges of the parchment sheet. These prick marks served as guides for drawing the horizontal lines where the text would sit. The spacing of these prick marks would determine the height of each line of text and the space between lines. Different texts and different schools of thought had specific ratios for line height to interlinear space, reflecting aesthetic and practical considerations. Once the prick marks were in place, the ruler would be laid across the parchment, aligning it with a corresponding prick mark on either side of the sheet. Then, the lead point would be drawn along the edge of the ruler, creating a faint, continuous line across the parchment. This process would be repeated for every single line of text on the page. In addition to horizontal lines, vertical lines were also ruled to define the margins, and for texts with multiple columns, to delineate the column boundaries. This meticulous grid, invisible in most finished manuscripts unless specifically sought out, was the foundational structure upon which the entire text was built. Scholars examining medieval manuscripts under raking light often reveal these faint ruling lines, a testament to the unseen labor and precision involved. The importance of this seemingly simple process cannot be overstated. Consistent ruling ensured that the text on a page was uniform, legible, and aesthetically pleasing. Without properly ruled lines, a student's handwriting would drift, margins would wander, and the overall appearance of the manuscript would be chaotic and difficult to read. This was especially crucial for complex academic texts, such as legal treatises, theological arguments, or scientific observations, where clarity and structure were paramount. A well-ruled page also maximized the use of expensive parchment by allowing for efficient and dense packing of text without sacrificing readability. The ruler and lead point were not just for text, they were also used for planning and drawing diagrams, musical notation lines, or the initial outlines for elaborate illuminated initials and borders. For geometry or astronomy students, the ruler was vital for constructing accurate figures and charts. Precision they offered was foundational to many aspects of medieval intellectual life. For a medieval student, mastering the art of ruling was as important as mastering the quill itself. It was the first step in transforming a blank sheet of expensive animal skin into a structured canvas for knowledge, ensuring that the valuable information it carried was presented with clarity and grace, ready for generations of readers to consult and learn from. Without these humble tools, the visual order and readability of medieval texts would have been drastically compromised. Number 4. The book satchel, or scriptorium chest. A medieval student, particularly one at a burgeoning university like Bologna or Paris, possessed valuable tools and even more valuable books. To protect and transport these treasures, a book, satchel, or a dedicated scriptorium chest was an absolute necessity. These were not simply casual bags. They were often robust containers designed to safeguard their precious contents from the elements, theft, and the wear and tear of daily academic life. The book satchel, known in some historical texts as a saccus librorum, was typically made from durable materials such as sturdy leather or thick-woven cloth. Leather was particularly prized for its resilience and water resistance, offering better protection against rain or dampness. These satchels were often designed with a flap closure, secured by straps and buckles, providing an extra layer of security. The interior might have compartments or dividers to separate different books, or to hold smaller tools like quills, inkwells, and parchment knives. The size of the satchel would vary, depending on the student's needs. A student of law might carry bulky legal commentaries, while a theology student might carry smaller, more numerous religious texts. Carrying straps, often broad and comfortable, allowed the student to sling the satchel over their shoulder or across their back, making it practical for navigating crowded medieval towns or traveling between academic institutions. Images from medieval manuscripts sometimes depict scholars with these satchels, highlighting their common use. For students who are also working as scribes, or for those with a more extensive collection of tools and reference materials, a scriptorium chest or desk box was common. These were usually made of wood, reinforced with metal fittings, and often featuring intricate locks. Such chests were less about portability for daily movement, and more about organized storage and secure transport during longer journeys, such as moving to a new university or returning home for holidays. A scriptorium chest could contain multiple quires of prepared parchment, several inkwells, a variety of quills, pumice stones, knives, rulers, and even small pots of pigment for illumination work. Some chests even had built-in writing surfaces or compartments designed to hold books open, serving as portable workstations. These elaborate chests underscore the value placed on scholarly tools and materials. The importance of these containers went beyond mere utility. Books in the medieval period were incredibly valuable. Each codex represented a significant investment of time, labor, and resources. Parchment was expensive. Ink was labor-intensive to produce, and the act of copying a book by hand could take months, even years, for a single volume. A single university textbook could be worth more than a peasant's annual income or even a small house. Given this immense value, protecting books was paramount. A well-constructed satchel or chest served as a mobile vault, preventing the precious volumes from being damaged by dirt, moisture, or light. It also deterred theft, a constant concern in medieval cities where poverty was widespread and opportunities for quick gain were sought. Students would often chain their books to their desks in libraries, but when taking them out, the satchel was the first line of defense. The book satchel also symbolized the student's identity. It was a visible sign of their academic pursuit, distinguishing them from merchants, laborers, or soldiers. Carrying a satchel filled with books marked one as a scholar, a member of the intellectual elite. This identity carried with it certain privileges and responsibilities within medieval society. For a student traveling to a new city to attend lectures, their satchel was their most important companion, holding the keys to their intellectual advancement. The loss or damage of a book from a poorly made satchel could be a devastating setback, not just financially but academically, as acquiring a replacement could be extremely difficult. The design and robustness of the satchel thus directly influenced the student's ability to maintain their studies and progress in their learning. Without a secure and reliable way to carry their books and tools, the medieval student would have been vulnerable to loss and damage, severely impeding their access to the very knowledge they sought to acquire. Number 3. The candle or oil lamp. In an era without electricity, artificial lighting was a profound necessity, particularly for a medieval student whose studies often extended into the dim hours of evening or before dawn. Candle or oil lamp was not merely a convenience. It was a fundamental tool that allowed the continuation of intellectual work beyond the natural light of day. Without it, reading, writing, and copying would have been strictly limited to daylight hours, severely restricting a student's productivity and ability to delve deeply into their studies. Candles, typically made from tallow, animal fat, or beeswax, provided a flickering, localized light source. Tallow candles were more common and cheaper, but they burned quickly, produced a strong, sometimes unpleasant odor, and often emitted significant smoke. Beeswax candles, on the other hand, were cleaner burning, produced a sweeter scent, and lasted longer, but they were significantly more expensive, often reserved for churches, wealthy households, or high-status scholars. A student on a limited budget would likely rely on tallow candles, constantly needing to trim the wick to prevent excessive smoking and maintain a decent flame. The light from a single candle was modest, casting a small pool of illumination directly around the flame, leaving the rest of the room in shadows. This meant students would often huddle close to their work, positioning the candles strategically to illuminate their parchment and text. Oil lamps offered an alternative. These typically consisted of a small vessel, often made of pottery, metal, or glass, filled with oil, such as olive oil, fish oil, or vegetable oil. A wick, usually made of twisted linen or rush, would draw the oil up to the flame. Oil lamps generally provided a more consistent and brighter light than tallow candles, and they could burn for longer periods without needing constant attention. However, like candles, they also produced smoke and a distinctive odor, and they carried the inherent risk of tipping over and spilling flammable oil, posing a significant fire hazard in buildings primarily constructed of wood and thatch. The cost of oil could also be a factor for students, making the choice between candles and lamps a practical consideration based on resources. Illustrations in medieval manuscripts often depict scholars working by the light of a small lamp, emphasizing the intimacy and concentration required for study in such conditions. The challenges of studying by artificial light were numerous. The quality of light was poor by modern standards. The flickering flame could cause eye strain, and the limited illumination made reading difficult, especially for small script or detailed diagrams. Smoke from burning candles or oil lamps could irritate the eyes and lungs, and over time it deposited soot on walls, ceilings, and crucially on precious manuscripts. Scriptorium rules often dictated that scribes must exercise extreme caution with open flames near valuable parchment, a constant reminder of the fire risk. Many medieval libraries and scriptoria, particularly those storing highly flammable parchment volumes, were constructed with fire safety in mind, including stone walls and minimal use of wood where possible. Despite these difficulties, the candle or oil lamp was indispensable for extending the workday. Students often rose before dawn for early morning lectures, or to engage in personal study before the day's commitments began. Many academic tasks, such as copying long texts, preparing lecture notes, or meticulously correcting errors, were time-consuming and often spilled into the evening hours. The availability of artificial light enabled these nocturnal pursuits, allowing students to maximize their learning time and produce the vast amounts of written material characteristic of the medieval academic world. It was a common sight to see a faint glow from a student's window long after dusk, signifying their diligent work. Furthermore, the act of studying by artificial light created a particular atmosphere. Quiet crackle of the flame, the dancing shadows on the walls, and the intense focus required in a small pool of light would have fostered an environment of deep concentration and introspection. It was a solitary pursuit, for many a testament to personal dedication. The economic realities meant that light was a precious commodity, not to be wasted. Students would extinguish their lights immediately when done, conserving fuel. The candle or oil lamp was not merely a source of light. It was a facilitator of knowledge, a silent partner in the rigorous intellectual life of the medieval student, making their academic journey possible during the long hours when daylight was absent. Without it, the output of medieval scholarship would have been profoundly reduced and the intellectual advancements of the era severely curtailed. Number 2. The book, the codex. The book in its codex form was arguably the most significant tool a medieval student possessed, representing the culmination of all other tools and the very essence of knowledge. It was the primary vessel for information, instruction, and debate. Unlike the ancient rolls of papyrus, the codex, a collection of folded and bound pages, was a revolutionary format, allowing for easier navigation, portability, and access to specific sections of text. For a medieval student, a book was not just a collection of words. It was a tangible link to ancient wisdom, theological arguments, legal precedents, and burgeoning scientific thought. Creating a book in the medieval period was an immense undertaking, a testament to the dedication of scribes and artisans. The fundamental material was parchment, sourced from the skins of animals like sheep, goats, or calves. Preparing these skins into durable waddes surfaces involved a multi-stage process of soaking, deherring, scraping, stretching, and drying. This labor-intensive preparation meant that parchment was incredibly expensive, often representing the largest material cost of a book. The finest parchment, known as vellum, came from very young calves or even stillborn animals, prized for its smoothness and whiteness. Once the parchment was prepared, it was cut into sheets, folded into quires, gatherings of pages, and then meticulously ruled with a lead point and ruler to guide the scribe's hand. Scribes, often monks or professional copyists, would then painstakingly copy the text by hand using quills and iron gall ink. This was a slow process, sometimes taking months or even years for a single large volume. Errors were corrected with a parchment knife and pumice stone, demonstrating the precision required. After the main text was copied, illuminators might add intricate initials, border decorations, and miniature illustrations using vibrant pigments to enhance the book's beauty and aid comprehension. These illuminations transformed a functional text into a work of art, adding further to its value and prestige. Finally, the quires were sewn together and bound often between wooden boards covered with leather, sometimes reinforced with metal clasps or bosses. The binding was designed to protect the fragile parchment pages and ensure the book's longevity. Some books were also fitted with chains, securing them to lecterns in libraries, preventing theft and ensuring their permanent availability for study in a communal setting. The physical characteristics of books varied widely, from large, heavy folios meant for a lectern to smaller, more portable octavos that could be carried in a satchel for a medieval student. Access to books was paramount. In early medieval times, books were rare and primarily found in monastic libraries. With the rise of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries, the demand for books exploded. Universities often established picia systems, where official exemplars of texts were divided into unbound sections, piciae, that could be rented by students for copying. This decentralized system allowed for faster and more widespread dissemination of texts, though copying still had to be done by hand. Students would spend countless hours in scriptoria or their own study spaces, meticulously copying lectures, classical texts, theological arguments, or legal commentaries, transforming rented piciae into their own personal library. The book was not just a source of information. It was a tool for active learning. Students would read, reread, annotate in the margins, and cross-reference different texts. They would engage in disputations, debating points drawn from authoritative texts. The physical presence of the book facilitated a deep, immersive engagement with knowledge. The weight of the book, the feel of the parchment, the smell of ink, and the visual beauty of the script and illuminations all contributed to the learning experience. A scholar's reputation was often tied to the quality and breadth of their personal library. Without a book, a student had no source material, no basis for argument, and no foundation for academic progress. It was the ultimate indispensable tool, embodying the entire intellectual enterprise of the medieval period, connecting generations of scholars through the written word. Number 1. The book weights or straps. When a medieval student sat down to study, often at a lectern or a sloped writing desk, they faced a unique challenge: keeping their heavy, often uncooperative books open to the correct page. This is where book weights or straps became indispensable. These humble accessories were not merely conveniences. They were practical necessities that facilitated comfortable and efficient reading and copying, allowing students to focus on the text rather than wrestling with stiff parchment pages. Medieval books, especially larger liturgical texts, Bibles, or academic commentaries, were often substantial. Made from thick, rigid parchment, bound between heavy wooden boards, they did not naturally lie flat. The stiff nature of the parchment, particularly when new or infrequently opened, meant that the pages would spring shut or flop over unless held down. This constant battle with the book could be incredibly distracting and make the meticulous work of copying or close reading almost impossible. Book weights were one common solution. These were typically small, heavy objects, often made of lead, stone, or even elaborately carved wood, sometimes covered in leather to protect the precious parchment. A student would place these weights on the margins of the open pages, near the spine or along the edges, to hold them down securely. The weight needed to be sufficient to counteract the stiffness of the parchment, but not so heavy or awkwardly shaped as to damage the pages or obscure the text. Some weights were simple, functional lumps, while others were crafted with some aesthetic appeal, perhaps shaped like animals or geometric forms. The sound of a weight being carefully placed on a page, followed by the quiet rustle of parchment as the student adjusted their position, would have been a common sound in medieval study halls. Another ingenious solution was the use of book straps. These were often made of leather or sturdy cloth, sometimes with small lead weights incorporated into their ends. The strap would be draped across the open pages, usually near the top or bottom of the text block, or sometimes diagonally across the page. The weight of the strap, or the small weights attached to its ends, would hold the pages flat. Some desks or lecterns were designed with small pegs or hooks onto which these straps could be secured, providing additional tension and stability. Straps had the advantage of being less intrusive than large weights, potentially covering less of the margins and offering a more uniform pressure across the page. They also could be easily moved as the student progressed through the text. Beyond simply holding pages open, these tools were crucial for any detailed work. When a student was meticulously copying a text from one book to another or annotating a commentary, they needed both hands free, one to hold the quill and the other to guide the parchment knife or to make corrections. Trying to simultaneously hold a heavy book open with one hand while writing with the other would have been an exercise in futility. Book weights or straps liberated the student's hands, allowing for uninterrupted focus on the demanding tasks of writing and scholarly engagement. They facilitated precision and reduced fatigue during long hours of study, which was a common feature of medieval academic life. Historical depictions of scribes and scholars often show them using these very tools to keep their manuscripts steady. The use of book weights and straps also speaks to the reverence and care afforded to books in the medieval period. These were not disposable items. They were long-term investments, carefully produced, and intended to last for centuries. Damaging a book by forcing it open or allowing it to continually snap shut would have been considered negligence. The weights and straps were tools of preservation as much as tools of convenience, helping to minimize wear and tear on the spine and binding of the codex, ensuring its longevity. In libraries, chained books also relied on these tools to remain open for public consultation, allowing multiple scholars to consult texts over prolonged periods without undue stress on the physical book. The silent presence of a book weight or a simple leather strap on a student's desk underscored the practical realities of medieval scholarship. It might not have been as glamorous as a quill or as complex as an inkwell, but its absence would have created constant frustration and significantly hindered the learning process. Without these seemingly minor aids, the medieval student would have found their primary tool, the book itself, far less accessible and far more challenging to truly engage with, turning the pursuit of knowledge into a constant physical struggle against the very medium that contained it.